Next, we are going to the other disorder, schizophrenic disorders, or sometimes we just call, in our everyday conversation, we just use schizophrenia. You change the C into A, schizophrenia. 中文里面哦，以前我们叫它做精神分裂。DSM 第4版以前，在中文世界里面，我们叫它精神分裂。在 DSM-5 开始以后，我们叫它思觉失调。In Chinese, we changed the name in DSM-5. But in English, it's still schizophrenia. The reason is, in English, it doesn't cause any confusion, but in Chinese, it did cause a lot of confusion because in the past, when people call it 精神分裂, people get confused with 人格分裂. It's a different disorder. So that's why in Chinese we've changed the name of that disorder. Now we call it 思觉失调. Actually, it will be easier to explain the disease in Chinese because 思觉失调, thinking, okay? People with schizophrenia, they tend to have delusions. Delusion means unrealistic thinking. And patients with schizophrenia, they tend to have hallucinations. Hallucination means unrealistic perception. So that's why delusion, 觉, perception, delusion, hallucination, and their perception and their thinking are unrealistic. Their perception and their thinking are different from the real life. So that's why we call it 思觉失调 or schizophrenia. Okay. It's qualitatively different from normal functioning. Okay, the word here, qualitatively, is important. The reason is, remember the normal distribution. When we are talking about depression or anxiety, every one of us could be more or less depressed. Every one of us could be more or less anxious. But it's just some people, they are just more extreme, so they are called depression or anxiety. But for schizophrenia, they are not like normal distribution. It's more dichotomous. You are either with schizophrenia or not with schizophrenia. It's more clear cut. There is no something in between. So they are different from most of other psychological disorders. And that is also why we say it's qualitatively different. For anxiety or for depression, they are quantitatively different from others. But for schizophrenia, they are qualitatively different. Okay, so it's quite different from between schizophrenia and other psychological disorders. And personality seems to disintegrate, and their thoughts and perception are distorted. That's why in Chinese we call it 思觉失调. 思 thoughts, 觉 perception, distorted 失调. Okay. Hallucinations. They see unrealistic things. They might tell you that they hear something that doesn't exist. They might tell you that they see something that doesn't exist. Delusions. They might think that people trying to do something harmful for them, or people trying to listen to what they were thinking. Okay, but they are unrealistic. Okay, let's have a look of this very good video about how a schizophrenic patient will feel. This is a very important message for schizophrenia. It's a magic number 1%, regardless sex, gender, race, social economic status. It's across different population around the world. It's 1%, 1 out of 100. Okay. Very consistent. And another phenomenon about schizophrenia is it's usually silent when you are a child or during your early adolescence. Usually it firstly occurs during the range between when you are 15 to 30. This range, okay, is the most likely that a person starts to develop schizophrenia. And this is how a patient with schizophrenia can possibly feel when he's walking in the crowd. Okay? He might hear people talking to them. Yeah. Okay, this video has 50 minutes, so we don't have time to really play all the videos. So if you're interested, you can watch it on your own. But basically the first 7 minutes has covered most of the important message about schizophrenia. Okay? So basically, one phenomenon is 1% across different culture, very consistent. And also, the age of occurrence ranges between 15 and 30. Okay. So why do people have schizophrenia? Actually, we don't know, but there are several hypotheses. Firstly, is it relevant to the genes? It seems to be relevant to the genes because if you do the genetic or twin study, if you see the twin study, if you compare here, monozygotic twins, identical twins, if one has schizophrenia, the likelihood of the other one having schizophrenia is 48%, which is significantly higher than dizygotic twins, which are fraternal twins. For fraternal twins, it's 17%. So if you compare the two, 70% and 48%, yes, genes are important. But it is not 100% important because even for identical twins, if one has schizophrenia, the other one is not 100% to have schizophrenia. It's still another 52% of likelihood that the other person doesn't have schizophrenia. So genes are important, but it's not 100% important. So there are something more than genes. But what is that more things? Can we learn any lesson from our brain, the structure of the brain? If you compare normal individuals and patients with schizophrenia, you can find for patients with schizophrenia, they have enlarged ventricles. What is a ventricle? This is a ventricle. This is our brain. But most of our brain is constructed by neurons. But there are some parts in our brain that doesn't have neurons. It's just space with some fluid inside. That kind of space are ventricles. And we have found that schizophrenic patients, they have enlarged ventricles than normal individuals. So ventricle is one marker for schizophrenia. The other marker is the gray matter loss. And what is gray matter? Okay, our brain is constituted by neurons. For those areas that neuron cell bodies are gathered, they look gray, so we call them gray matter. For the other parts that axons are gathered, we call them white matter. And as we grow up, we will lose our gray matter, but not too much. However, for patients with schizophrenia, their loss of gray matter is much more significant and more faster than normal individuals, like these illustrations here. So this is normal individuals. When we grow up, as time goes by, we lose our gray matter, but the loss is not too much, okay, just slightly. But if you look at the gray matter loss for schizophrenic patients, is much more obvious. Okay. The more it is, the redder it is. Okay. So probably it's relevant to our gray matter loss. So genes are important, and brain, we can somehow tell something from the brain. Do we have more kind of holistic theory to explain schizophrenia? We still haven't. There are several hypotheses. There is also another hypothesis, but I didn't list it here. It's called dopamine hypothesis. And it's one of the neurotransmitters. And we have found that schizophrenic patients, they have higher dopamine they have higher level of dopamine than normal individuals. Okay, so probably it's also relevant to dopamine. So that is dopamine hypothesis. This is another hypothesis we call diathesis stress hypothesis. What is diathesis? Diathesis here, you can understand diathesis as something like genes. You need the genes. To have a schizophrenia, you need to have the genes. So your genetic factors place the individual at risk. If you don't have the genes, then you wouldn't have the symptoms. So you need the genes first. But genes itself, it doesn't guarantee that you would have schizophrenia. You still need another factor. The other factor is stress. You also need stress to initiate the disease. Okay? So you need a gene. Also, you need an environmental stress that can trigger the symptoms. Okay. So there is another study. It's a more kind of 9-month longitudinal study conducted published in 2009. It was a 9-month study, and they recruited schizophrenic patients. At the beginning of the study, they measured those patients' emotional reactivity. And what is emotional reactivity? If you have high emotional reactivity, it means that you are more sensitive to a stress. The same stress, some people they are more sensitive, some people they are more reactive to them, some people are more sensitive to them, then it means that they have higher emotional reactivity. But for some other people, they are not that reactive. They seem to be numb to the stress, then we would say that they have low emotional reactivity. So the stress itself is not sufficient. The same stress will be interpreted differently according to your emotional reactivity. Okay? If you are more emotionally reactive, you will feel more stressful than people with low emotional reactivity. And then, after their emotional reactivity has been measured, after 9 months, they come back to the lab again. Okay? The patient has to report their life event from the preceding month. So it's a 9-month study. Okay? So they measure the reactivity at the beginning of the 9 months. At the end of the 9 months, they got asked, what happened to you 1 month before the 9, what happened to you during the 9th month? Okay. And this is their result. For patients, for people who have low emotional reactivity, whatever stress occurring to them, it doesn't really matter to them. Okay. If they have stressful event for the past month, like the purple line here, then the vertical axis here denotes the change in delusion and hallucination, the numbers of delusions. Okay. The higher, the worse. Of course, if you have too many delusions, that means that your symptoms are more severe. So for low emotional reactivity people, no matter they have stress event during the preceding month, yes, no matter they have or they didn't have, it doesn't affect their hallucination that much. But for patients with high emotional reactivity, if they don't have traumatic event, stressful event for the past month, then of course their hallucination is low. But if they are unfortunate, they are very reactive to emotional events, and they happen to have stressful event for the past month, then their delusions, the number of the delusion is very high, which tells us that stress is relevant to schizophrenia. The higher stress you have, the more delusions you would have. So that's why they came up with the diathesis stress hypothesis. You need the genes first. If you don't have the schizophrenia genes, probably you wouldn't develop schizophrenia. So you need a gene. But in addition to the genes, you need a stressful event to trigger your symptom. Okay? So that was schizophrenia. Let's move on to the next this group of psychological disorders. This one, dissociative identity disorder. Probably people are more interested in this kind of disorder because it's more interesting. The symptom is a single person, but he or she will tell you that he has multiple personalities. Although it's a single person, but actually there are different people living in his or her mind. To be honest, we still don't have many cases, like reported cases. So we don't have a very good theory or very good hypothesis about this disease or this disorder. But because of the nature of this disorder, you can find this disorder, dissociative identity disorder. Okay? It used to be called multiple personality disorder, but we call it dissociative identity disorder now, or sometimes we just call it DID. You can find DID in many like TV series or movies. It's much more common in movies or series than the reported cases. And here is one of the TV series which I find interesting. It's an American TV series. It's called United States of Terror. So this is the leading character of this TV series. Her name is Tara. And the name of this TV series is called United States of Terror, which means that although there is only one individual whose name is Tara, but inside of Tara, there are many different kinds of states. Okay? And this is her original state, a suburban housewife. So this is one of her other states, a teenage girl. This is one of her states, a man. Actually, in addition to this TV series, you can easily find many movies, novels about this disease. And because compared to other more boring psychological disorder, it's more fascinating for some reason. But to be honest, academically, we don't know much about it. And why? Although it's not very because we don't have enough case to come up with a very good theory about it. But like psychodynamic, the way they try to explain this kind of disorder is probably it's a strategy, it's a defense mechanism strategy. People develop another personality in order to hide those traumatic events. Okay? People who have experienced traumatic stress, they will use defense mechanism to push the traumatic event out of conscious awareness. Sometimes it's too hard to repress those traumatic events. So a better way is you just develop a totally new identity. So if you are a totally new person, everything that happened to the old person is irrelevant to you. So probably it's just a strategy you develop to cope with your traumatic events. But unfortunately, we don't have solid data about how to, like the prevalence, what's the percentage of people who develop this disease. Of course, we don't know why. We don't exactly know why it happened. And some people even believe that it's totally faked. Like people, they just act, or it's a created disorder. It doesn't exist. Anyway, we don't know much about it. Next, psychological disorders of childhood. There are some disorders, they are more prevalent for children than adults. Okay? The first one, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. 在中文我们叫过动症。So for ADHD, if they have two major symptoms. The first one, inattention. They can't concentrate. The second one is they are, according to the name of the disease, the disorder, hyperactivity. So they are very hyperactive, very, very active and hyperactive. So sometimes you might find them extremely naughty. But probably for you, you might be wondering, of course they are children, so of course they can't concentrate. Of course they could be naughty. How could you call them a disorder? Actually, ADHD itself probably is not too big an issue. The issue that comes with ADHD is, you can imagine in a class, if one student is more impulsive or more naughty than other students, probably the teacher wouldn't like the student. If the teacher doesn't like the student, probably the student will get less resources. He will get less education, and it could affect his academic performance. Another thing is, you can imagine if there is a group of children, they are playing together, and one of the children unfortunately have ADHD. So for ADHD children, they are not that patient. Sometimes when you are playing with other children, when you are playing, you have to follow the rules. But kids with ADHD, sometimes they don't follow the rule. They are impatient. So probably other kids wouldn't like him or her. So ADHD probably will cause the child to have social problem. So ADHD itself probably is not too serious. What is serious is those problems, academic performance or social skills, those problems that come with ADHD. Okay. But to be honest, we still don't know what is the cause of ADHD. We still don't know whether there is any particular region in your brain that can predict your ADHD. We don't have much knowledge about ADHD, but we just observe that ADHD children, they have these kind of symptoms. And also, it's more likely to see ADHD on boys than on girls. And another kind of interesting thing is you can hardly see any ADHD adults. ADHD seems to be a kind of disorder that uniquely happens to children. If you use the same criterion, you can't find any ADHD adults. Okay, this is some phenomena about ADHD. Next one, autistic spectrum disorder. In the past, before DSM-5, DSM-4 before, you might have heard of the term autism or Asperger, 雅斯伯格跟自闭症. They used to be separate disorders. Okay? But from DSM-5 onward, we've integrated the two disorders. We call them autistic spectrum disorder. The word spectrum means it's a spectrum. So it's a spectrum. So on a certain point of the spectrum, it is what we used to call autism. And on another point of the spectrum, it is what we used to call Asperger. But in the past, we separate them into two different categories. Now we integrate them into the same thing, but just on different points of the same spectrum. And the symptoms about autistic spectrum disorder, or ASD, is they have severe disruptions in the ability to form social bonds. They have difficulty to develop an understanding of other people's mental states. Okay? So they might behave in a way that is not accepted in this context, or they might say something that is not accepted in the particular context. Okay? And usually, they have problems with language development, and they have very narrow interest. So when they like something, they can spend hours on doing that thing over and over again. Okay? And they have repetitive and ritualistic, 仪式性的 ritualistic behaviors. Okay? And we don't know what is the cause of ASD either. Just like all the psychological disorder we have discussed so far, we don't know the cause. We just know the symptoms. We just observe, we just acknowledge their existence, but we don't know why they happened. Okay? So there have been many people, they have proposed many different hypotheses, and they have tried to find a way to find whether there is any sign to predict ASD. And there is a potential sign. For babies, if you find, usually for 1-year-old babies, if you smile at them, usually they will smile at you back. But for ASD babies, chances are you smile at them, but they don't smile at you. They don't even look into your eyes. Okay? So it's a possible sign for ASD. And actually, there are many different kinds of hypotheses about ASD. And if you look at the statistics, if you compare boys and girls, there is a very, very significant difference between boys and girls. It's more likely for boys to develop ASD than girls. So actually there is a theory called masculine brain hypothesis. Because if you still remember when we were talking about developmental psychology, for human fetus, at the beginning, every human fetus the default value is a female fetus. But why do half of the people become male? The reason is because of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome will generate a series of transformation to transform this female fetus into a male fetus, including the brain. And during this transformation, some people, they are more transformed. Some people, they are not that transformed. For some people, they are very, very transformed, up to a point that their brain becomes very, very masculine, a highly masculine brain, the effect is this person, this brain, probably they have better skill at like some kinds of spatial thinking. They're better at spatial navigation, but they have lower capacity of empathizing others, which is similar to the symptoms of ASD. Okay? So this is one of the hypotheses. Some people, they hypothesize that why do people have ASD? Probably they just have too masculine brain. Okay. Anyway, so far we have discussed many different kinds of disorders, and as you can see here, we don't know the cause of any of them. We just acknowledge their existence. And people have been trying to use different ways trying to fix those problems. And what way to fix those problems, it depends on what kind of training you received. Okay? You could be a behaviorist, you could be a cognitive therapist, you could be a very a follower of Sigmund Freud. Okay? So if you are from different training backgrounds, you will adopt different ways to fix these psychological disorders. Okay, the last topic for today, we're going to introduce you the psychological health system in Taiwan, because this is where you're living in. Okay? In Chinese, 心理医师, this is a very commonly used term in newspapers, magazines, and TVs, but actually this kind of title, it doesn't exist in Taiwan. We don't have something called 心理医师. We have 3 different occupations that are relevant to psychological health. Psychiatrists, 精神科医师, or psychologists. And in psychologists, we have different kinds of psychologists. One is clinical psychologists or counseling psychologists. And what are they doing? For psychiatrists, 精神科医师, they are medical doctors. The training they received is not different from other medical doctors. In Taiwan, you have to take the course in the Department of Medicine, and you have to spend 7 years. And then after that, you have to pass some kind of national exam to get a license, and you are working at hospital or private clinics. 可能在个人，大部分在医院啊，可是现在在台湾也有一般的私人诊所 （private clinics）， 然后他们是精神科医师，包括在新竹也有。And what they do is, of course, they can do diagnosis and they can do prescription. Okay? Clinical psychologists, 临床心理师哈。And in Taiwan, you have to get a master's degree in clinical psychology. Okay? This is according to the law that now, probably the law will be modified, but now, if you want to become a clinical psychologist, you have to get a master in psychology. So if you just have a bachelor in psychology, it's not sufficient. Basically, you can't become a clinical psychologist. So you need to at least have a master. And you also have to take an exam. You have to pass the exam to get a license. And where you're working is, you could be working in hospitals or private clinics. And what you do is not too much different from a psychiatrist. But the major difference is a psychiatrist can prescribe. But for psychologists, no, they can't prescribe. Another title, counseling psychologists. You also need a master's in counseling psychology, and you also have to pass an exam to get a license. And where you are working is different from clinical psychologists. For counseling psychologists, the places where they are working are mostly like schools or like universities, like here, 交大. In our counseling center, we have counseling psychologists, or sometimes they work at organizations, and they also use psychological therapies. They can't prescribe either. Okay? So we have 3 different kinds of job titles relevant to psychological health. 心理医师不存在哦. Okay? This is something very important. And this is a suggestion that some people, they seek help. For seeking help, motivation is important. When you see a doctor, when you see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, sometimes they will want you to do some exercise. They will want you to take some medication. Do you really want to change? The motivation is important. Actually, if you don't want to change, probably no matter what kind of psychologist or psychiatrist you see, probably it doesn't really help. So motivation is important. So that was for Introductory to Psychology for this semester. If you still have any question, you can come to the front after class. And if you don't have any question, then thank you for today. Thank you for this semester.